Hello, I'm back. It's been a little while. Sue me. Today we are going to be looking at the Sector 9 downhill division in its entirety. All the boards, and we're going to rank them on this tier list. Been a little while since we've done a tier list, but been a little while since we've done anything. Alright, so let's take a look at what we've got here. A couple things to note about Sector 9 downhill division. Probably the most legendary lineup of downhill boards. Sector 9 is a huge brand within longboarding in general. It's gone through its ups and downs with downhill, more recently on the downs. Maybe with some maybe with some up in the future. I think they're under new ownership or back to original owners' ownership. That's the rumor. Who knows? So what we're looking at here is downhill division of Sector 9 is a legendary lineup of boards. Something that people really like about Sector 9's downhill division is that they usually released boards as a lineup. Madrid sometimes does this too, but most brands don't actually do this. They released each year or every 2 or 3 years they would release their downhill division lineup and would release like 3 to 7-ish, I don't know, that might be the most, 3 to 7-ish boards at a time, and they kind of had like a different flavor for everybody depending on what kind of downhill you are looking to do. So the original lineup is going to be these guys, the yellow pinup girl style boards. There's what, six boards there. Then they had the second generation of pinup girl, which a lot of times people don't even realize there was a second generation, but this is where, not as good of a picture, but where you have a lot of similar looking graphics, but you'll notice that they look different in that the coloring in the background is no longer yellow. It's either the green Tiffany, which is kind of a standout, or blue or red. Then third, we've got the, I don't even remember what they called this series, but it's like the Warrior series, or yeah, I guess you could call it the Skull series, where we've got a lot of different color going on. And then from there on out, we kind of have like, I couldn't find like group pictures for these, but we have the Ripped, is what they call it, which is this kind of like tie-dye style graphic that they did. And then there's also like the blocky colors one. I don't really know what to call that one, but yeah, those guys are the most recent ones. I do want to make note that I did find this image. I've never seen these before in my life, but I'm wondering if this is the actual first ever downhill division, was these 3. They even have like some of the similar images to what you see the early downhill division, where they have kind of like a different art style, but same idea with the pinup girl here. So I've never seen this before, but very curious about it. So anyways, let's go ahead and get started. So first board that we're going to take a look at is the Annika, which is off of the first, I think, the first downhill division lineup. So let's take a look at the Annika. The Annika is a massive board. It is a 40.875 inch board, and interestingly enough, from this lineup, it's the only one that says it's a pro model or a signature model. It's the Erik Lundberg one, a European rider. I think he might be from Norway. I could be wrong. Who knows? But it's a huge board, 48.875, and it might even have the biggest wheelbase options, 31.6 all the way to 33.1, not to mention the 10.3 width. Now, one thing that's going to be noted is like 90% of the boards in, well, not 90%, 1, 2, 3, and 4 of these boards are all pintail style. We're looking at a time period in like the late 2000s where we're using pintails, but literally just like with more plies, just stiffening them up and skating downhill on these things. They all have a very pointed nose, coming to an almost point in the back, or sometimes an actual point like the Roxanne. But the Annika, and you can't really see it here, has this little swallow tail, which I think is pretty sick altogether. And also, if I'm correct, the Annika has a pretty intense W concave. I think this is a pretty good shape. I think that the overall giantness of it makes it very unique. I think it's a pretty good shape overall. I'm going to put this one in the A tier Annika. Going with the next board up, we're looking at the Sector 9 Arrow, which is coming off the 3rd iteration of boards, and I do have a group photo of that one. So let's take a look at the Arrow. I actually have skated this one before. A friend of mine has an Arrow. He skated it for a ton of time, and it's a pretty solid board. It's coming as the second rendition of the Daisy, which we'll talk about a little later. One thing I will say that I don't like as much about the arrow is it's got like crazy deep concave. And this is coming from a time period where concave was kind of like the only way that we were locked in. We didn't have like seismic or any other grip tapes. We also were still on pretty wide boards, so we couldn't really heel hang too hard to keep ourselves on the boards. So they deepened the concave as a result, and also did this to stiffen them up. I also want to say that the arrow was one of the first boards that they used fiberglass on, so it's super stiff altogether, but I will say it's like so steep in the concave that I'm pretty sure the center of my foot, and I have pretty good arches, but I'm pretty sure the center of my foot just like does not touch the actual surface of it. So unless you're angling your foot super, super hard, it's hard to get contact with all of it. That being said, still a great board. It's based off the Daisy, which I'll spoiler alert, I'm a big fan of. The tail is incredible on this thing. I think it's a pretty good board, but it's definitely not the best iteration of it. I'm gonna throw the arrow in the B tier. Next up we have the Barge, which is actually very, very similar in a lot of ways to the arrow. Now the Barge is a board of its time. It was a board that was kind of based on this trend of bricking your boards. People would used to chop their boards that were more shaped into these like overall like square-ish rectangular shapes. And this is just kind of like a big trend of the time period. So as a result, Sector 9 kind of just put out this board that was literally just a brick. The concave on this thing is super, super sick. Where the arrow kind of tightened up the concave on that Daisy mold, the Barge is literally just the Daisy mold, which was a little bit more mellow. And not only that, but they also brought the wheelbase in a little bit. Now, this is one of the only downhill division boards I've actually owned before. So one thing I've noticed about the Barge, which is kind of insane, is that its front truck mount is literally on the drop point, but where other boards would put little mini flush mount in there to kind of level the truck out, they did not do this here. So if you actually mount your truck the way that it's meant to be mounted in the front, it literally, like, the center of the base plate isn't touching anything. Only where the mounting holes are, only where the bolts are, is where your truck is actually touching. Insane, kind of, that they would release it that way. But I'm pretty biased. I think the Barge was pretty sick at the time. I still think it is pretty cool if they made it maybe slightly more narrow. I think that people would still be skating the Barge, even though I'm sure there are still some people that are skating it. I just don't see it that much. It's pretty awesome. I like it a lot. I'm going to put it at the top of A tier. I'm going to swap the Annika, so it's quite good, but I just think that I love the shape, love the concave on it. The tail is great as well. I just think that like mounting thing is kind of insane and maybe a little bit more narrow. All right, next board up we have is the Bomber. Bomber is another one off of the same lineup here. It is probably the one with the most unique concave, I believe, of all of these different boards. The Bomber has like W in the back, where you'd expect it to be, and then it has like this like small area of W in the front. It seems like it would be extremely uncomfortable to me. I've never stood on one of these before, so I can't attest to it. I do remember a lot of team riders actually riding the Bomber when it was released. That concave in the front seems pretty rough though, to be honest with you. The shape is a blunted nose, where pretty much everything else is pointed. The Barge is definitely blunted as well though, I will say. So I guess you could say this is almost a more rounded shaped nose. I think the Swallowtail is pretty cool too. It's not just like straight points that it comes down to here at the end. They kind of flatten out, and I like that. I think it's a pretty good shape overall. The concave, not so much for me, however. So I'm gonna go ahead and give the Bomber a C tier, maybe even a low B, but we'll just put it in the C tier because I'm not trying to be too positive here. All right, the next board on the list is the second generation Sector 9 Brandy, which is this blue one here. Let's get a better picture of it. So the Sector 9 Brandy is a board that I have stood on before. It's pictured here, very pixelated, sorry, but is what it is. It overall is a pretty solid pintail shape. However, at the back, it just kind of like narrows off kind of intensely here, and the rails look pretty straight overall. I can't really tell if it wants to be a pintail or if it wants to just retain its width throughout. I don't really like that narrowness about the back. The concave on this one, I believe, was pretty simple tub concave, so a pretty decent concave. I don't really like it, especially when I'm comparing it to all these other pintails that are definitely going to be on this list. It's one of my least favorite pintail shapes of them. Being a little critical here, but there's a lot of boards here. I gotta be critical. Brandy feels kind of mids to me. I think it's just a decent B tier right in the middle of the pack. Up next, we're looking at the Sector 9 Daisy. Probably one of, if not the most legendary downhill division decks of all time. The Daisy was Louis Pilloni's pro model deck at the time, and honestly kind of changed the game for downhill boards. Whereas we were looking at pretty much straight top mounts previously, this board did the micro drop, or I think what they call it is rocker drop, which is basically where you take a drop deck and where the actual drop happens, you kind of integrate that in with concave by making the drop over a longer period of space, where a rain board was making a drop over a scale of like 3/4 of an inch to an inch, a very short amount of space to create that drop, making a really harsh piece of board to push your foot up against. The Daisy was kind of like a more mellowed out, maybe over 3 inches drop, kind of creating this hammocky feel, but really just where your feet go, which felt really locked in and nice. Not only that, but they created like one of the best downhill kicktails ever. It's actually pretty flat throughout, but right at the end, it kind of swoops up. It's not like a harsh angle, right? It kind of like swoops up gradually like a transition. And this feels super good on a really big board. I believe that the Byron has a very similar tail. So if you like the Byron tail, you'd probably like the Daisy tail. Daisy tail I think is a little bit more mellow than the Byron tail, but still an amazing tail for a downhill board for sure. Overall, the Daisy has got to be one of the best ever. Right now, it is sitting cleanly at the top of the pack with an S tier, our first S tier. Daisy. All right, next up is the Sector 9 Dojo, this purple guy right here. Sector 9 Dojo was a very big board of the time. This was a more compact wheel cutout board. And when I say wheel cutout board, I mean the shape. Whereas where the wheels are, the board is cut out. Now, why you would do this is because you want your wheels to have so much clearance. If you have giant wheels on 80, 85 mil, and you can kind of like make it so that there's no board there, so there's no opportunity for wheel bite. Unfortunately, the Dojo also combined this with a really tight wheel cutout area with a drop that was pretty intense. I want to say it was like 0.75, 3/4 of an inch, something like that. And it just like suffered from insane wheel bite issues all the time. There's one of these on Facebook Marketplace right now in my area, and I'm always tempted to get it, and then I'm like, I wouldn't really skate it. I'm not a collector. This is probably one of the least well-designed downhill division boards ever. It's gonna go in the D tier, the Dungeon. Next up, we have the Ginger, the Sector 9 Ginger. The Sector 9 Ginger was crazy construction for its time period. I wanna say the Ginger was like GMAC? George Mackenzie's pro model? Don't quote me on that. But it was the only drop deck of the older generation of downhill division. It's looking at, this is a great picture because it's got all the specs right here, making it so easy for me. This is a relatively shorter for the time period drop deck at a 30.2 to 32.2 inch wheelbase, which sounds crazy big to nowadays standards, but it was actually pretty small for then. When you're looking at like the Rain Demon Seed, I think it had like a 34-inch wheelbase or something crazy like that, but yeah, this was kind of compact. The drops on this, I have skated this one by the way, feels super good, and for a drop deck, its shape is very interesting because where the drops actually happen, which are a lot steeper like compared to the Daisy, the drops are pretty steep, but they kind of like had the shape of the board as very, very like soft lines. It's very rounded here, whereas like a Rain drop deck had really like sharp cutouts for where that is to maximize where you'd put your feet. This board also had pretty unique construction. I want to say it has carbon in it. And I think this was like pretty wild for the time period to have a board company as big as Sector 9 integrating composites into their construction. Sector 9 Ginger is really pretty fantastic board. It feels really good underfoot as well. I still would probably skate it in certain instances. Probably not gonna get crazy performance out of it, but still feels really, really great. This is going to be another A tier board. I'm going to put it below the Barge, but above the Annika. Next board on the list is going to be the Sector 9 Jacko. Sector 9 Jacko was Jackson Shapira's pro model board, which he had a couple iterations, I think 3 of this board. This is the, I want to say like 2016, 2017 even. Oh, wait a second. No, this is the ripped variant. So I think that's, I don't know, I could be wrong. It's definitely post 2015, one of the later iterations of his board. This iteration of the board is very interesting. When you look at the concave of this board, it's pretty interesting, especially compared to what are fairly minimal concaves across most Sector 9 boards. Jackson Shapira's board had, I believe for all of the iterations of it, had kind of like wheel flares in front and back, had more mellow concave in the back, and it also had, I believe, W. So there's like a lot going on here. And this was, you know, not super uncommon for the time period. A lot of people are putting a lot of features into the concave. And when I say a lot of features, you know, not to say that we're not doing that now. We are. Look at a ton of different board brands. But they're like pretty extreme. So these wheel flares are going to be what people would nowadays call uncomfortable, probably. Now, this is, I think, the second or third iteration. And basically all that Jacko did with his pro models is just shorten them and shorten them and shorten them, I believe. Possibly mellowed out some of the concaves throughout time, but this is one of the stubbier versions. It's still a whopping 10 inches wide at its widest, and I think that kind of throws the proportions of the board off for me a little bit. Honestly, if it was like maybe a quarter of an inch narrower on each side, I think it would do it a lot of favors as far as the shape goes. Not only that, but I think that where the trucks mount in the front, it looks a little wonky. I like to see a little bit more nose on the front, especially with a heavy pointed nose like this. I wish that it was just kind of brought in a little bit. I think of all the different iterations, this is probably one of the worst ones, I think, even though maybe it performs better. I just don't think the shape looks as nice. Not only that, but this is definitely my least favorite lineup of graphics. They just come across as pretty lazy to me. Some people might like them, but I just don't really think there's really much going on. It definitely doesn't compare to like the pinups or the Warriors as well. They kind of lost some of their appeal with the graphics as time went on, in my opinion. This iteration of the Jacko, I think is not that great compared to the other ones. I'm gonna put it in the D tier. It's not my favorite board for sure. Next up, we're moving back to the Warriors. We are looking at the Sector 9 Javelin. Javelin. This board was skated by so many people on the team, and it's the most familiar to us compared to the pinup girl style, because this is the one board here that truly looks most like a pintail. It's much more mellowed out as far as its taper goes, but it is still a pintail at the front and back. It does have some taper, all that good stuff. One of my favorite boards from this lineup. It's also one of the most simple. I think it's literally just concave, maybe some rocker, but I'm pretty sure it doesn't even have rocker. It's just straight concave, and that's pretty much it. And a pretty comfortable, more mellow concave, something that would actually probably translate pretty well today. It's also very stiff. It's got some fiberglass in it. I believe it was the Arrow, the Javelin, possibly the Bomber, having that construction, and I think they released these at like 140 bucks or something like that, where the other ones were closer to like 100. Like the Barge, I'm pretty sure was like 90 bucks. 9-ply maple, can't go wrong, but these other ones were a little bit more advanced in the construction side of things. I think the Javelin is inoffensive. I think it's still kind of holds up today. I think it's a pretty solid board. We're gonna go like, we're gonna go low A tier. I don't know, maybe, yeah, I think the Annika edges it out a little bit, and just that the Annika is so unique and just how giant it is. It feels like a massive surfboard. I can't imagine skating. It probably feels really wild while sliding it, but this was in a time period where most people were just like foot braking for the most part. Probably feels sick carving down mountains on that giant Annika. Next up is Jimmy Riha's pro model, the Jimmy Riha, I think is all it's called. Jimmy Riha's pro model, I think it had 2 iterations. Yeah, here we go. We've got the blocky colored one, I don't even know what to call it, and the ripped version of it. I believe they're pretty much the same thing, so I'm just going to mention them once, even though the graphic does change. For mention, I'll say we'll say I like the blocky version better. I'm not really sure if I do. Yeah, it looks a little bit better. This board is pretty similar in a lot of ways to the Daisy. It's smaller, similar in shape, but instead of drops, it's got like a more like progressive rocker feel throughout. It also has a slightly shorter tail. This is actually a pretty similar board to like a lot of single kickboards that we're seeing to this day, with wheelbases of like, 24-ish, something like that. And it's overall, it's okay. I've stood on it before. A friend of mine has one of these. I think he still skates it sometimes. And it's just okay to me. I just feel really like in the middle about it. It's an easy B tier for me. It's fine. I don't think it's that great. I don't think it's bad, but it probably would be a board that I would grab. Next up, we have the Gauntlet, the Sector 9 Gauntlet. The Gauntlet is, where is it? Is right here, and it's pretty similar to previous versions of the Natasha, which we're going to talk about. The Natasha, or the Gauntlet in this case, the really big difference is this is a drop-through board, one of the only Sector 9 drop-through boards. It's pretty much totally symmetrical, but it has gas pedals. Gas pedals basically were like a thing that we don't do anymore, or at least I don't see anybody doing them anymore, where they take the rails where you would have the concave come up, but they kind of cut or sand down the edges so that there's like this hard like curve where the concave is typically really sharpened off at the rails. The idea was that if you hang heel, you still have something to push against. People realized they would rather just have that sharp rail there, so we don't really see this anymore. I think this is the worst iteration of their drop-through boards of all of them. I'm gonna go ahead and put the Gauntlet at the bottom of the C tier. I do love a drop-through. I've got love for them. There's nothing like raging high speeds with a drop-through. It feels very different from a top mount. I like the kind of delayed input that they have. It's very unique. But I think that the Gauntlet is not a very good iteration compared to their other ones. Next up, another board that I'm not super fond of. I'll be honest, I don't know a lot about the concave of this board, but the Lacy, and this is the blue iteration, the second iteration of the Lacy. I'm not huge on this shape. There's probably a lot you could do with it with a chop, but we're not talking about chopability here. The Lacy, I think, it's a pretty boring shape. It's this rounded tail at the back I really don't like. The front nose is pointed, but it feels like it doesn't want to fully commit to the point. I'd rather it be a more committed shape overall. Probably skates fine. I just think if I'm comparing it with the other boards, it's probably one of my least favorite shapes. I'm gonna put it at the top of D tier. Oh, top of D tier. Top of D tier. Come on, Jacko. There we go. And back to back, we'll compare it with the yellow Lacy, the earlier Lacy iteration, which I think was a lot more committed, even though it is still probably one of the more rounded shapes of this era. This one I think is a little bit more committed to its tapered, rounded shape. I don't have much more to say about it, even though this one probably, again, it's a really big giant board, 30.6 inch wheelbase, pretty large. I think it's a slightly better shape, but I still don't really like the shape, to be honest with you. I like my pintails to have a true pointed nose, and these are just kind of like these kind of dinky round noses. Probably holds up to impact better, but whatever. Come on, we're all vibes here. We're gonna go ahead and put this one bottom of the C tier. Not a big fan, but it's definitely better than its later generation version. We're coming back to the Jacko here, but in this case it's the first iteration of Jackson Shapira's pro model, the HiJack. And the HiJack, where'd it go? This, you can kind of actually see the concave here that they had going on. This is the largest version of Jackson Shapira's pro model, but it is very intense on the concave. It's hard to see, but you can kind of get like along these rails here, you can kind of see how wavy it is, and that's because of those wheel flares as well as less concave in the back. There's so much going on. To be honest with you, these rails are kind of ugly with how wavy they are, but I like this iteration proportionally a little bit better than the later stubbier versions. Again, if he had made them not only shorter but also narrower, I would probably truly like the later iterations more, but this one, not huge on, but I like it a little bit more. Bottom of C tier for me. Next up, we have the Sector 9 Tiffany. Tiffany was a kind of like late push on the Sector 9 downhill division for this generation. They did not release this one with the other 5. This was a pro model of, oh, blanking on it, but his nickname was like Scoot, which is funny because we have Scoot Mano now, but whatever. This board was weird because it just had a front drop. It did not have a drop in the rear, which definitely would kind of put your weight forward, which probably feels pretty good, but I think it's a very ugly board. That wheel cutout semi, but not totally at the front, looks a little weird to me. Just don't like it. I do like the swallowtail at the back, and the taper is pretty okay. I don't mind it, but I just really don't like the nose shape that they have going on here. I would have liked it more if they had just kind of filled that out. It's not like they're gonna save on any wheel bite issues by having that there. I truly wish that they had just kept the rail consistently rounded throughout there instead of cutting it out. The Tiffany is probably one of the ugliest boards on this list. It's going above the Dojo, but it is going to go in the D tier for me. Next up, we have the Sector 9 Natasha, the red version of it. The Sector 9 Natasha is like the Gauntlet, a drop-through deck. It's got symmetricalness to it, which is very common for the time period. This was like 9 to 5 from Land Yachts time period, where symmetrical, free-rideable drop-through boards were really common. I think it's an okay version. I like it more than the later Gauntlet version, but I just think it's just okay. It's going to go in the C tier for me. Finally, the last, or the first, iteration of the Natasha is going to be the first one, which is, the big difference here is it is not symmetrical. It has its own shape. The front is slightly wider than the back. It's not magnifying. Come on. Let's try it again. Alright, what you gonna do? So you can kind of see it here. It's actually a directional shape. When I think about drop-throughs now, they're kind of like obsolete as far as performance go. So really you'd only go for this going straight off of the vibe, right? Going off of that super low ride height, that kind of delayed turning response because you're so far off of the truck and because you're not on top of the truck. There's less leverage over it and all the wheels. So it's very surfy feeling with how low it is and with how delayed the response is. And I just feel like doing, you know, switch slides and stuff like that is not really what I would go for even to take a look at one of these. Floating down a big mountain run and just schlubbing through sweepers feels like it'd be really fun on this board. It's probably my favorite drop-through board from Sector 9. It's gonna go probably like just below the Arrow, middle of B tier. The last iteration of the Louis Pilloni Pro model was, I believe, also called the Arrow. I might be wrong. Actually, I think it's just called the Louis Pro or the Louis Pilloni Pro. This board is rocking that blocky kind of colored graphic. Kind of lazy, not really into this graphic style, not really sure where they came up with this, but the big difference here is the concave at the front. They mellowed out where your heel would sit for your front foot. I believe the back concave is the same as the Arrow, but the front is a little bit more mellowed out, which probably feels a little bit better. The only thing is, like, I truly just like the idea of the Louis Pilloni Pro just kind of like feeling symmetrical. It's this giant single kick board. It's very roots, and I feel like kind of taking that like more complex concave angle kind of takes away from the whole vibe of the board a little bit. I still think it's a pretty great board. It's still got a lot of the same features of the Arrow, but I just don't like it as much. I'm gonna put it, let's put it below the Natasha, the first iteration of the Natasha, in the middle of the B tier. Next up, we have the second iteration of the Roxanne, and I really like this board quite a bit. Roxanne is a great shape to it. It's very similar to the Javelin, but it's a little bit elongated feeling. I think that it's got a really tasteful taper in the nose. It's not too blunt, it's not too pointy. It's nice, it's pretty committed to that shape. It has this pretty nice like diamond tail going on here. I like it a lot. Kind of reminds me of the diamond tail on the PT Blaze, but a little bit more mellowed compared to that one. This is probably one of the best iterations of a pintail style board, a little bit wider. I think the proportions are just like pretty perfect on this Roxanne for me. I'm putting this Roxanne at the top. in S tier. Fantastic board. I think the proportions are just so good. It's tasteful, it's timeless. Love the Roxanne from that second generation. We're almost there, we're almost there. We got 2 more boards left, and they are both OG classics from the first iteration. So the first one that we're gonna look at, I think, yeah, there it is the, and we're kind of going back to back here, with the older Roxanne. Now, when I look at this board, this looks like literally like the old Sector 9 pintails that you would find in like Zoomies or something like that. Like, this comes down so narrow at the back. I feel like this is, I know it says 10.125 at its widest, but that's like here. When we go all the way back, this is probably looking at like 7 inches, 6 inches. I mean, with these boards, you'd be sitting way forward on them, way up here in the meatier sections of them where it's in the 9 to 10 inch range. That is so narrow at the back. It's true pintail. It's very committed. I do like how it commits to that shape. I'm not 100% positive if it's actually like something that would feel very good underfoot. I'm gonna put it, oh gosh, maybe like top of B tier, we'll say. Top of B tier. I could maybe put it at the bottom of A tier. I can see that for sure. All right, our last board. Woo! We made it. Last board is going to be the Sector 9 Brandy in its first iteration. Sector 9 Brandy honestly feels pretty similar to me compared to the last board we just looked at, which is the Roxanne. Tapers down a ton. The concave honestly must be where the big difference is between these boards, because even looking at the specs, Roxanne wheelbase 30 to 31-ish, Brandy 30 to 31-ish, width 10.25, width 10.125, overall length 39.5, overall length 42.5. Alright, so we got a little bit more length here, but they're almost the same exact board, which is kind of crazy to me. I'm wondering almost if maybe one of them was meant to be ridden with like traditional kingpin trucks and the other with reverse kingpin trucks. I'm not positive on that, but I know that people still did ride TKPs back in the day on downhill boards. You'd ride them with wedges and with huge beefy like eliminator style bushings, things like that. This might be pre-eliminator actually, maybe just super hard bushings. But really don't know where to put the Brandy. I'm just gonna put it right next to the old Roxanne, and I think that is going to cap it off. We're looking at the old Daisy and the old Roxanne at the top, where we kind of look like that second gen looks like to me, where probably Sector 9 was doing its best work here. Tell me what you think. So many boards, this is a long video. Woof. See ya.